Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Mara. I'm with the Women's Environment Development Organization, and I want to first begin with gratitude to you all for being here and to this incredible set of panelists for joining me. I'm honored to be among these powerful voices here at COP27 and in the climate justice and feminist movements in the United States. And I hope we can use this space today to really speak to some of the connections between movements for justice in the US and in this global space, and how US-based racial, economic, and gender justice advocates are understanding how the US government and delegation must show up in this space, conscious and accountable to our role as the world's largest historical emitter, a country resistant to real action and real distribution of resources, and who still drives forward systemic militarism and imperialism in our policies, actions, and impact. We are all representatives of the Feminist Green New Deal coalition, a US-based coalition of gender and climate justice advocates who are committed to global solidarity and justice, and understanding our role in the US to be to heed Global South feminist demands and push for a more just world by owning our access and responsibility to pressure our own government and uproot the root causes of white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism that drive injustice at home and abroad. We know many today are paying attention to the arrival of President Biden and the US congressional delegation, and watching how they determine the course of the US's action here at COP. We know the President and the US delegation would like to use recent legislation being passed in the United States as their checkmark for action, without recognizing its perpetuation of environmental racism and sacrifice zones in the United States, and its utter disregard for implications of global justice. As civil society representatives from the US, we'd like to lay out our vision for feminist climate justice, and we'll continue to call out the US government. I'd like to pass to Catherine at my left.
Thanks, Mara. Nich Pachwai, Inwas, Mewitalu, Inwas, Nimipu, Lixiu, and Numu. Good afternoon. My name is Catherine. I am Paiute, Cayuse, and Nez Perce, a citizen of the Confederated Tribes of Umatilla in Oregon in the US, and the communications coordinator for the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, as well as a member of the Feminist Green New Deal Coalition. I am honored to be here with you today and with these really amazing feminists and speakers. Before I dive into things, I really wanted to take a moment to honor the land we are on today. Beyond these boxed walls and the concrete, the land that lies beneath us, the deserts that live and exist for generations, the oceans that lie to our east. There is so much ancient wisdom and knowledge here, and I hope that, as we enter our second week in COP, we can really hold on to and learn from what this place has to offer. And in a lot of ways, this is also why I am here. For me, I come from snow-capped summits and palisaded cliffs cut by ancient rivers, desert highlands and mountain forests, a place of abundance, a place that my ancestors have called home since time immemorial. And I am here for them, for my relatives, for all living beings, for the matriarchs in my family that have cared for me, that have cared for our communities and our lands. And so I show up in this space hoping to offer that same care to our lands and our communities. Since European contact, capitalism, colonization, and patriarchy have been working hand in hand to erase indigenous communities through physical violence, violation of indigenous sovereignty and rights, and destruction of the lands and communities we call home. And the climate crisis is an extension of that, further worsened by the governments and fossil fuel industries that walk through these halls here today and continue to invest trillions in climate chaos, environmental degradation, and false solutions. What governments are doing now is clearly not working. We need an intersectional approach to climate policy. Women globally are being hit hard by government inaction and the climate crisis, specifically Black, Indigenous, Latinx women, other women of color, low-income women, and women from the global South. They're all bearing the brunt of these impacts. And it is clear that the US has played an outsized role in contributing historically to the climate crisis, while also enacting policies that harm indigenous communities worldwide, which is why we need a systemic approach at all levels to truly address the root of the climate crisis and dismantle the systems that continue to desecrate and violate our lands, our bodies, and our waters. And through the Feminist Green New Deal principles, we are urging the U.S. to confront institutional patriarchy and racism and to secure rights-based policies and programs at the international level, at the national level, that recognize and include and uplift Indigenous rights and sovereignty, and also address the global implications of all of our policies. 80% of the biodiversity left on the earth exists within Indigenous territories, primarily because of our relationship to nature. And so fighting to protect Indigenous sovereignty and rights is a vital and realistic solution for protecting ecosystems and mitigating warming to 1.5 degrees. Each community carries a vast wealth of traditional ecological knowledge on how to live in right relationship with the land. In my communities and many globally, women are the ones holding this knowledge and are vital to passing that on to future generations. So for me, it also makes sense that Indigenous women's leadership is vital if we want to save our planet. Through the Feminist Green New Deal and many other initiatives, we are calling for the solutions, the expertise, and leadership of Indigenous peoples to be centered in policy-making decisions, and for Indigenous rights and sovereignty to be upheld and included in all levels of climate policies and negotiations. This includes binding legal recognition of Indigenous land rights, real enforcement of free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC, as well as UNDRIP, and recognition of the rights of nature. This also means not only ensuring that climate policies like the IRA in the United States align and support Indigenous communities and territories, but also that laws and policies that uphold tribal sovereignty, like the Indian Child Welfare Act, which is threatened to be overturned by the Supreme Court, must remain protected and upheld. Our tribal sovereignty is a solution to the climate crisis, and we can't allow for that to further be degraded over time by these conservative Supreme Court decisions. So ultimately for me, I know that there's no path forward without Indigenous peoples, and the sooner governments can stop appeasing fossil fuel lobbyists and start building in true partnership with our tribal communities globally, we will continue to see these corporate takeovers of climate negotiations that unfortunately lead to nothing but empty promises and hollow pledges. So this is the time. We need to implement, and we need to ensure that Indigenous peoples are at the table and that our solutions are centered, invested in, implemented to stop these detrimental extractive systems and instead invest in climate policies grounded in feminist solutions, human and Indigenous rights, justice-based approaches, and Indigenous peoples are leading the way. Katsiaya, thank you. Margaret.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Margaret Kwateng, and I'm a national organizer with Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, which is an alliance of about 60 grassroots organizations around the United States fighting against militarism, the war at home and abroad, for climate justice, and for grassroots feminism, which we think of as feminism that is centering BIPOC, poor and working class women, and gender nonconforming folks, both in the United States and in the global South. So as we all know, we're at a critical juncture. Many of you have read the IPCC report that says that climate change is accelerating faster than we thought, and we are seeing the acceleration and intensification of climate crises around the world. We know that many of the solutions that are being talked about here are not going to work because they don't address the root causes of the problems that we're facing, which is an extractive economy that prioritizes profits over Indigenous knowledge, profits over bodily autonomy, profits over culture, profits over the health of our planet, and profits over human rights. We need to cut emissions at source and keep fossil fuels in the ground. The US government has played a big role in pushing market-based solutions, nuclear, carbon offsets, and its sibling nature-based solutions that we are hearing again and again at this COP, and other false solutions that time and time again have failed to stop or even slow climate change. As grassroots feminists based in the United States, we are saying enough. If we want a real reduction in emissions and in the impacts of climate change, we must follow the Feminist Green New Deal principle to reject false solutions and go after the culprits that created this crisis. There are more than 600 lobbyists from the fossil fuel industry here at COP, which is a disgusting statistic and a reminder, as you were saying, of the corporate capture of this space. Forcing a stop to fossil fuel extraction and expansion is barely on the table here, let alone military emissions, which have never been a part of the negotiations, despite the fact that the US military is the #1 polluter on the planet. Mm-hmm. We need a just transition from our militarist, extractive economy to a feminist, anti-racist, and regenerative one. A just transition that centers indigenous and human rights, that recognizes the centrality of women and gender nonconforming people in this struggle, that requires nations of the global north to pay reparations for the harm caused to the global south, both through colonialism and the acceleration of climate chaos, and that divests from harmful institutions like prisons and the military and instead invests in care-centered ones. In a feminist economy, we recognize, value, and center reproductive labor, which is low carbon, community-generating, life-affirming, and skilled work. It is necessary, and it should be considered when we think about what green jobs are. Mm-hmm. A feminist economy focuses on ensuring bodily autonomy and self-determination as it relates to feminized and gender nonconforming people, to the socializing of reproductive labor, and to being in right relationship with people globally, as well as in right relationship with nature. To get to a regenerative economy, we need to have an orientation that is based in care and stewardship. Gender justice is climate justice, and climate justice is gender justice. As I am sure many of you have seen, we have been constrained this year in our ability to organize for solutions that we know are necessary. We know that freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom to organize, and freedom to challenge state and corporate actors is essential to the realization of climate justice. Mm-hmm. We stand in solidarity with calls to respect and uphold human rights in all aspects of the UNFCCC negotiations, as well as locally here in Egypt, in the recognition of the human rights struggle of political prisoners and prisoners of conscience in Egypt, inside the United States, and around the world. We stand in solidarity with tens of thousands of Egyptians and millions more around the world surviving excruciating conditions. We demand the release of all political and environmental defenders, including Allah, and call for the US government to prioritize his release in their negotiations. There is no climate justice without human rights. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Frances Roberts-Gregory, and I'm a feminist political ecologist and eco-womanist, climate justice abolitionist. I hail from Duplin County, AKA Hog Country in Afro-Carolina, also the DMV, and Brick City, also known as Newark, New Jersey. I currently live, teach, and research within the traditional and ancestral lands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations and peoples. I'm affiliated with institutions on the traditional and stolen lands of the Wampanoag and Massachusetts peoples. So, as a scholar, educator, activist, I'm committed to queer, feminist, and abolitionist solutions for environmental, energy, and climate justice. As a Fem Green New Deal advisory board member, I also use feminist activist methodologies and scholarship to advance a feminist just transition, feminist environmental and energy justice, and feminist climate action. And the feminist is really important. Most importantly, my work leads me to center embodied and lived experience. My lived experience as a Black woman, a survivor of sexual and gendered violence, and a descendant of working class Black folks, sharecroppers, and formerly enslaved African indigenous folk, leads me to the realization that any call for climate justice must also promote regenerative, sustainable, cooperative, and collective models. It also must promote holistically sound, safe, healthy communities that current and future generations can not only survive, but thrive. As a Fem Green New Deal Coalition member, I have a lot of reflections. Our coalition manifested in 2009, has challenged me and forced me to move beyond my comfort zone and critique all that I hold dear. As an academic, I traverse multiple worlds and I speak multiple tongues in the pursuit of what some would call freedom or liberation. This work is often critiqued as work that exists in the ivory tower. However, the work that I do as a community-based and feminist scholar actually shapes a feminist future in the spirit of New Deal policy architects like Frances Perkins and Mary McLeod Bethune. So as we transition from discussions of the Green New Deal to the Inflation Reduction Act, I want us to pause and think about what this moment really means. So let's talk about the elections. We're living through reactionary conservatism and a backlash of electoral gains made by the women's rights movement, the civil rights movement, and environmental rights movement. Since the 1960s, we've seen a rise in US conservatives resisting social movement gains and also a reinvigoration of voter suppression and gerrymandering in majority BIPOC voter districts. These are the same folk who vote for feminist climate justice. We, nevertheless, must use our political education and electoral activism as Fem Green New Deal board members to combat the rise of this reactionary right-wing conservatism. We also must challenge threats to reproductive health and abortion rights. We also must remember that this just transition must be a gender-just transition. We have to be wary of greenwashing in the renewable sector that is still dominated by white male elites. We mustn't forget critiques of sustainable development, critiques that have been heard since the 1980s. We must rethink multilateralism. When we think about calls or we hear calls for loss and damage, which is very important at COP27 and climate reparations, we mustn't forget US-based EJ communities who are still struggling in sacrifice zones within the borders of the global north. So how do I engage all of these issues in my own work? As the advisory board chair of the Hive Fund for Climate and Gender Justice, we fund over 100 grantees in the South, a region that is an emerging clean energy, was home to emerging clean energy opportunities, but yet has experienced low levels of philanthropic funding. We are also building not only people power, but cultural power, gender just power to stop the expansion of dirty energy industries and also increase the power of women, BIPOC, and frontline leaders. Finally, as a program director at the Initiative for Energy Justice, we are ensuring that equity is centered in our discussions of the just transition. We are also ensuring that everyday folk have an understanding of utilities, that everyday folk have an understanding of equitable local solar, and also that understanding that these technologies are not gender neutral and that a gender lens is needed in assessment of all renewable energy projects. So in closing, never forget that frontline communities, women, queer folk, youth must be included in decision-making when it comes to this new energy democracy and also in the fair distribution of benefits of all energy projects, a particular goal in the US of the Justice 40 initiative. And we mustn't ever forget that our care practices aligned with healing justice are crucial for the sustainability of our political activism, and this will allow us to unapologetically achieve our abolitionist political ends. Thank you.
Yes, hi. My name is Jacqui Patterson. I'm with the Chisholm Legacy Project, a resource hub for Black frontline climate justice leadership, and it's an honor to be here with you all. When I arrived in Egypt, since I've arrived in Egypt a few days ago, every day someone will ask me, how's it been for me here? And I always kind of say that I'm 75% here, 75% at home, and 25% here in terms of my attention. And this is the reality of organizing as a Black woman in the United States and how consuming it is. We're holding so much in terms of accountability to our communities, which means we're holding so much in terms of both challenge and also in terms of the promise of inspirational leadership that's modeled by so many. So what's also occupying what's holding me in terms of occupying 75% of my time at home is communities like Ironton, Louisiana, where there are women there organizing, grandmothers, granddaughters, and so forth, who are organizing around the fact that they're a community that has been hit time and time again by hurricanes and disasters. They're a community that is surrounded by industry. They have a coal terminal next to them. They have an oil terminal next to them. And they were ravaged by the most recent storms to the extent where their cemeteries were unearthed and they had caskets floating through their neighborhood. And then afterwards, then came through their neighborhoods the folks who were from a railroad that wanted to take advantage of the fact that they had been displaced, that they were down, and they said, oh, you know, this is going to happen to you time and time again. We want to buy your land, and displace them from this historically black community that they had lived in for so long. And so now they're looking at these contracts that they're trying to push on them to get them to move from where they've lived for their entire lives. So we're working with them to provide legal support. What's also occupying my time is a place like Sand Branch, Texas, which is right out of sight of Dallas, Texas, which is one of the richest cities in the world. And yet this community, a historically black community, has not had running water since the mid-'80s. The mid-1980s, and so the community has been fighting to get water since then. Meanwhile, they not only don't have running water, but they've been declared to be a floodplain, even though they've never had a flood in the history of their community. And so that means that the Federal Emergency Management Association has now agency has now offered them money to move. Again, the displacement of our communities that are historically black communities. And so they're asking them to move, and they're paying them for houses that have been in their families for generations and generations, $350 for their homes and land, and this to be displaced from the only home that their families and their families before them has ever known. But yet, one thing that is keeping me up is the fact that the folks who are in leadership there, Phyllis and Tonette Bird, both black women who are leading this effort in spite of kind of so much that's against them. So that kind of gives me hope, and it also makes me want to stay up, to continue to work with them and support them. And on Tuesday, what kept me up all night until dawn was the elections and watching the returns from the elections. My heart broke as I saw another black woman, Stacey Abrams, who certainly deserved to be the governor of the state of Georgia. Yes, and who is displaced by someone who does not have the very principles and practices that we talk about here at heart of what they are leading on. But what also woke me up in the morning with joy was the wins of people like Mary Black, who's for the council person for Raleigh, and Pamela Pugh, who won her seat for the Board of Education in Michigan, in a place where she is constantly getting threats, but she pushes on, and as she fights against people who are trying to get critical race theory out of the schools and so forth. So as I focus on what's happening here at COP27 and determine how to most use my time most usefully, I think about what will it take to make all of this worthwhile, all of these thousands of people that have come together, all the greenhouse gas emissions that were spent to get people here. And we also know the forces, even our own government, pushing back against loss and damage, pushing back against the very types of decisions that we need to see made here. And we know that the principles and practices of the Feminist Green New Deal around creating regenerative economies that center systemic feminist alternatives, ensuring democratically controlled and community-led solutions. So we have to embrace the fact that this is not only possible in terms of how we transform our economy, but it's actually necessary in order for us to all, as we say, not only just survive, but to actually thrive. So we saw how the other day I actually did a talk with a group of students, and at the end of the talk, which was fairly not so happy and positive as it could have been, but the person who was facilitating asked me to leave the students with some hope, and then he said that they just that last week they had a speaker there from Pfizer who was the CEO of Pfizer Pharmaceuticals, and he said that at the end he left the students with hope because he talked about how they had created a vaccine in 9 months. And I said, well, you know, I said, yes, I could see that in terms of hope, in terms of what's possible, but what drove them to do that was profits. And so we know that that is driving too much of the decisions here. But what that did tell us in the context of COVID-19 is what's possible in terms of people coming together around mutual aid when we all decide that we have the will and the love for each other to pull together. What is possible in terms of universal basic income, and we saw people all getting money to be able to go from day to day. What was possible in terms of being able to provide energy, be able to provide water without the threats of shut-off for non-payment, not punishing people for the price of poverty. And so in wrapping, I know our sisters here is giving me the signals here. So we know that we can, we have a planet that's divinely designed, and it's designed with regenerative abundance. So we know that we can have water for all in a world that's 2/3 water. We have people like the Black women-led work like the We the People of Detroit that's pointing the way. We know we can have food for all. We have a Black woman-led effort called Soul Fire Farm led by Leah Penniman. We know we can have energy for all in a world where the sun rises every day, the wind blows every day. And folks like here on the continent, Everjoyce Wind, running a group called Shine that provides renewable energy to all. And we know we can have safe, healthy, and sustainable housing for all with people like People United for Sustainable Housing and Rawa Gramat Zion. And we know finally that we can have livelihoods for all, and the groups like Crenshaw Rising, where communities are taking back their land and taking back economic development. And again, we can all enjoy a vision that's more than just barely surviving, but actually thriving in abundance for all, following the Feminist Green New Deal principles and practices. Thank you so much.
A huge thank you to my fellow panelists for sharing your wisdom and words over this time together. I'll close with saying that, as you have heard here, the harms, obstruction, and systemic violence perpetuated by the U.S. government within the U.S. and around the world will continue to be called out by civil society, will continue to be challenged by any and all who are committed to racial justice, gender justice, economic justice, global justice, and climate justice. We will continue to raise the key demands of civil society here and at home and uplift human rights-based frameworks that demand pressure be made to release Alaa Abd el-Fattah, all political prisoners here and in the U.S., persecuted and incarcerated for defending human rights, the land, and all people. We have a different vision, and we will make it known. Thank you all for being here.